Sports design is boring right now. So many people in the industry are thinking it, but I don't think enough people are saying it out loud. Think about the last time a sports graphic actually stopped you mid-scroll. Not because it was clean, not because the colours were nice, but because it made you think, wow, this is so different and unusual. I love how creative this is. That feeling is becoming rare. And the reason for that is that everyone is pulling from the same pool of inspiration, the same techniques, the same elements, and essentially robbing the techniques, compositions, and elements from the exact same PSDs. If you're tapped in with the community, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And look, I'm not here to call anyone out, but I do think there's a conversation worth having about where sports design is at right now, and more importantly, where it could go. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I've been pushing my own work into new territory, specific techniques, real examples from my own designs, and the kind of thinking that I think separates designers who have a style from designers who just borrowed one. So let's talk about why this is actually happening, because I don't think it's as simple as saying designers are lazy or just want shortcuts. It's a bit more systemic than that. There is an entire economy built around Photoshop files right now. Templates, asset packs, shared files where you can literally open up someone else's project and see exactly how they built everything. And on the surface, that sounds like a great learning tool, right? You get to see inside the process of someone whose work you admire. Like me, for example, patreon.com/neovisuals, link in the description. But here's the problem. When you learn from a file instead of a process, you learn shortcuts, you don't learn principles. You learn how that specific person solved that specific problem. You don't learn how to think. And thinking is the only thing that actually makes your work yours. No word of a lie, I have seen someone post a speed art of them making an edit, and you can very clearly see within the footage them taking things from other PSDs and in fact using someone else's PSD as a base for their own work. Literally just overlaying a few different images onto someone else's work and then going around saying that they made it and this is a video of their process of making it. Did you really make it, or was 70% of the work already done for you and then you just added your own player images and called it a day? And obviously, just as a disclaimer, I'm not saying this applies to the whole of the sports design scene. Like, there are still very good creative sports designers out there, but I'm just going off a few instances that I've seen. And for those that this does apply to, the result of all of this is a new generation of designers who can execute really well, but struggle to originate. They can build something that looks professional, looks clean, ticks all the boxes, but then ask them to do something that's a bit outside of their comfort zone, and they don't have the tools for it, because those tools aren't in the PSDs that they were taking all their techniques from. Those tools come from curiosity, from experimentation, from pulling influences from places other sports designers aren't looking. And you can come at me for allegedly being a hypocrite because I sell my own PSDs, but I actively preach to people not to just take the things that I've done and just copy and paste them into their own work. And I myself practice what I preach. I don't really have a signature style. I like to experiment and do different things myself. And that's why anyone taking things from my PSDs isn't necessarily biting my whole style, because I have versatility within my design work. And that stemmed from me taking the time to experiment within my designs. I really believe that it's best for the community, and for new designers especially, to learn in the same ways that I did, through experimentation and through actually doing things ourselves. Textures and distortion maps will really make your work look like it exists in a physical world rather than just a flat screen. Most sports graphics feel digital because they are entirely digital. There's no material quality to them, there's no weight. And that can very easily be mitigated against with textures. They bring that material quality, whether it's paper, whether it's fabric, whether it's grain. It brings life to an image and it brings depth. Here is this recent Cherokee design that I've made. If I zoom in, you can really see the grain and the texture and even a subtle halftone in there, especially on these darker areas where you can see the texture and also on his face. Here it is without any textures at all. You can see it's kind of flat. It's clean, but it's kind of flat. There's not really much life to it. And here it is with them. As you can see, there's just a lot more going on. And it's also differentiating from other sports graphics and other sports designers that don't really tend to use these kinds of rugged sort of fabric textures. Even things like this outside border over here kind of add this dimension to it. And I'm not saying you always have to use textures. If you want that clean look, you can still use that clean look. But if you're thinking about experimenting and you want to do something different, I think that textures is the one takeaway that I would 100% give to everyone. If you can take away anything from this video, take away this section, being the textures and distortion maps. Right now I kind of have my own set of textures that I don't really tend to differentiate much from, apart from maybe adding like certain things like a halftone here and there. If you're really stuck and you have access to my PSDs, you can maybe take my textures as a start, for example, but I wouldn't recommend this necessarily because there are so many textures available online. A really good reference for how to use textures well and what kinds of textures to use is the YouTube channel Doron Studio. The main textures that I use were sort of built off of his method. But if you want to create textures and don't really know where to start, I'll give you a free cheat code using just 2 layers. A halftone texture and the new Photoshop feature, the grain adjustment layer. To create a halftone texture, just create a new layer, go to Edit, Fill, and then add a 50% gray fill. Then go to Filter, Filter Gallery, and in Sketch you'll find halftone pattern, and this is all you can use, and you can change the size and the contrast and also the pattern type, whether you want lines, dots, or even circles. For halftone, we're just going to use dot. You can adjust the size and contrast however you want, have a play around with how big you want your halftone textures to be, and then put it on a blend mode, usually something like overlay or soft light. Here's before, and here is after, and now you can control the opacity however you want. Something like this is quite nice, maybe a bit stronger. And then you can overlay this with grain, so if you go to your adjustment layers, there is grain right here in Photoshop 2026. You will need the latest version of Photoshop to have this, being 2026. If not, you can always just add grain in Camera Raw filter, and then just add your grain, change how rough you want it and the size. And now with just these 2 layers, here is before and here is after, you can see there's a little grainy halftone kind of texture going on. It almost looks like it could be a fabric texture in of itself. And I think this is a great way to get started, and then you can go and experiment with other grunge, fabric textures, paper textures, that sort of thing. Another thing that can help to create texture while not necessarily using texture overlays is displacement maps. Displacement maps take this even further by warping elements as if they're pressed onto a surface or printed onto something real. And I use so many displacement maps in this Cherokee design right here, and I'm going to take you through what it does and how you can use them yourself. So essentially you can see all of these kind of jagged edges going on here. That is the work of a displacement map. Because if I remove everything, you can see it's literally just a picture of the Etihad Stadium. But if I apply the displacement map, it turns all of this a bit weird, a bit kind of jaggedy, and adds a bit of texture to it. And this is because of me applying what is called a displacement map, where it will take the texture of a black and white image of something like this, for example. This is what I use to create that effect, and it will warp the elements to match the texture that's going on in the image. So as you can see, there's this grunge texture here that I've put in, and by going to filter, distort, and then displace, and then choosing my horizontal and vertical scale, I can then choose this displacement map, which will then make this image displace according to this. A similar thing I've done to this background text here, and also this box over here, in which I've used this paper texture to displace it. And as you can see, it's kind of got these jaggedy edges, especially this box right here, which kind of looks like it could be a paper cutout. And that's because that paper texture has allowed it to look like that. And the key thing here is distortion maps and textures aren't just about making things look grunge. They give the design a sense of dimension, they bring life to an image, and they bring depth. Most sports designers treat text like a caption. The best designers treat it like a shape. Especially in sports design, type is normally just functional. Name, number, statistics. And although that's a great way to add small details to designs, that's the floor, not the ceiling. Editorial design, book covers, album art have been treating type as the centerpiece for decades. I already broke down in my Thames design dissection video that every element you see here is solely made up of typography, using different font weights, different effects such as bevel and emboss here, very subtle drop shadows here, glows, and a stroke effect to make things stand out and make typography work a bit differently to just displaying information. Coming back to what I talked about in section 2, it goes along really well with typography as well. With this Dybala text for instance, I used a distortion map, the same paper distortion map that I was talking about, to give this almost paper cutout effect, these jagged edges as you can see, and then a very slight drop shadow that doesn't really have much spread or size. It just attaches itself to the bottom of the letters here, and that makes it look like I've pasted paper on top of the image right here. It looks like I've cut out the letters from a separate piece of paper and glued them on. And that's because of not only the distortion map, but also the slight drop shadow here and the texture. You can see these textures. It looks like an almost paper kind of texture. And that just adds to the realism and adds to this effect. And again, although the composition is kind of the centerpiece of the design, so is the typography. It's not really out to the side in any way. I've just slammed it on top and I've left it here as another focal point. And also, like I explained briefly in the Thames design dissection, when you're using typography, you have to make sure that if you're using different fonts, they go together. This Thames kind of headline text is this nice serif kind of calligraphy style font. And then you have the subtext that's nice, it's readable, but it also looks good. And because it's sans serif and it's white, it's not really distracting from the main typography that's going on here. It's just adding a little bit extra detail and a bit extra information while not distracting from this main text here. Smaller text like this can add a little bit of detail to some areas that might be lacking. And you're also going to want to typically use smaller text for added pieces of information. For example, here in this Leve design, the album name and the track list. So there's tons of ways you can use typography. You can use it as a mask, you can have it interact with the subject, you can have oversized type right here, for example, that bleeds off of the canvas. And there's so many effects that you can put on your typography as well. For example, bevel and emboss, to give it a more realistic kind of shiny feel. You can adjust whether your fonts are sans serif or serif. You can adjust the spaces in between letters, for example, the kerning as the official term goes, and add distortion maps to them like I did here and here. This is a really underrated tool, especially when it comes to making backgrounds look cooler. Essentially, a gradient map replaces the tonal range of an image with a color range that you define. The result is full control over the color story of your graphic or certain elements within the graphic, and it can get you some very, very unique color treatments. One way I experimented with gradient maps a lot was on this Dybala edit right here. For example, this thing in the back is literally just the Juventus badge, but masked and put into a gradient map. And as you can see, it's altered all of the places where the badge hits, and it's kind of inverted the colors in Dybala's hair here, for example. And this just creates a unique effect, especially which is not really used in sports design. You don't really see inverted colors very often. Often inverted colors like these are more often associated with grungy sort of designs, maybe psychedelic or surrealist. But by using a gradient map, we can have these colors kind of inverted in this way. And it's again just a nice unique effect that is a bit different from what everyone else is doing at the moment. Even if I reverse it, you can see it's still making some difference. It's adding the orange tone, but it just doesn't look as cool. This just kind of adds a bit of dimension, a bit of depth. And of course, this is paired with distortion maps. As you can see, these kind of jagged grunge edges here, especially over here on this part. And this just goes to show I practice what I preach. Everything that I've talked about in this video are things that I've implemented myself, and they all go along with each other. And also the use of gradient maps to also help color grade slightly. To match the orange badge that's going on in the back, I added the same gradient map to the back image of Dybala and the front image of Dybala. And that in turn made them more orange, and it kind of color graded them and made everything a lot more cohesive. Another way that I use gradient maps that is a bit more unconventional is to make your highlights stand out. And I use this a lot of the time on lighting based edits like this Mares revamp, for example. And here I have a gradient map going from black to blue, set to the color dodge blend mode. And if I put it to 100% opacity here, you can see the difference very clearly. It essentially makes all of the color tones in the image go to this kind of tone, but also makes them brighter. So for example, here is before and here is after. You can see all of the brighter areas have been bumped up with this blue color here. As you can see, everything just turns a lot blue, a lot brighter. and that helps those highlights over here to stand out. I don't have this on 100% opacity all the time, usually I tone it down just a bit, just to add a bit of much needed brightness and nicer color tones to the highlighted areas. And one thing to keep in mind, make sure you change this color based on what your highlights are if you're using this method. If your highlights are going to be a more red orangey tone, change this color to be red, or maybe this kind of deep orange, for example. And of course, just like everything else I've talked about, but especially for gradient maps, it's all intentional. The colors that you choose and where you place them in the gradient changes everything. I wouldn't have got this inverted effect like you see here if I didn't place my colors in the way that I did. So if I'm here telling you that sports designers are all using the same style and taking all of the same elements, but you want to look for inspiration for your designs, for example, you might be asking, well, where do I look for inspiration now? If I look for inspiration from these people, aren't I just copying everyone else? Well, yes and no. It depends how much you take. A quote that's resonated with me a lot is, steal like an artist. You shouldn't be taking absolutely everything. You should be taking little increments from a variety of places. I've been inspired by so many designers over the years, but when you take a look at my work, you can't see one specific place of inspiration that I've derived my style from. It's a collection of all the things that I've seen and liked over the years, as well as my own style and my own experimentation. So you can take things, just don't take everything. And it's probably not the best idea for your sanity and for your own personal growth if you're just straight up robbing things from people's Photoshop files either. But if you want to experiment more and you want to differentiate yourself even more, then here is what I would recommend. If every designer you follow is a sports designer and every piece of work that you're saving to your inspiration folder is a sports graphic, then your ceiling is essentially someone else's floor. You're capping yourself before you've even opened Photoshop. The designers who actually have a recognizable style and have versatility, they're pulling from all realms of design and bringing it back into the sports design space. So let me give you some actual places to look. Firstly, editorial and magazine layouts. Study how they handle composition, how they use white space, how they use type and image to interact. Sports design almost never uses space and composition in the way that editorial does, and that's exactly why it's worth studying. The best example of this is Night Design, who is very much a sports designer but also ventures into the realm of editorial, and that's why his use of typography and shapes and layouts are second to none. Album artwork, particularly in rap and alt music, is pushing composition and colour in directions that most sports designers aren't even aware of. Those areas of design really love to experiment with different textures and colours, especially with techniques like dithering and using things like inverted colours like I've talked about before, and just ways to add different textures to a design through distortions, through threshold, and through the texture overlays themselves. And even photography. This one sounds abstract, but just hear me out. Especially if you do photo manipulation, these can teach you how to see geometry, how to find structure in an image, and how you can use negative space. So let's bring this back to where we started. Sports design is boring right now, but the designers producing work that blends in aren't talentless. Most of them are technically capable. The problem is, they stopped being curious. They found a formula that works and they stayed there, and look for shortcuts along the way, sometimes even through biting other people's work. Everything I've discussed in this video, none of these are formulas, they're just starting points. The whole point is that you take them somewhere that you haven't taken them yet. So here's what I want you to do. Open a project, any project, and bring in one reference that has absolutely nothing to do with sports, and just see what happens when you let that influence the work. That's how you develop yourself as a designer, not by being the best at executing what already exists, although that's still very much part of it, but by bringing something new into your work. Like, subscribe, all of that, and I'll see you in the next one.
Okay, that's all the time I've got.